My guest tonight is Andrew Gavin Marshall. He is a freelance researcher and writer based in Montreal, Canada. He has written for a number of publications, including Alternate, Truthout, and Counterpunch, and has frequently appeared on radio shows and television interviews, including Russia Today and CBC Radio. His website is andrewgavinmarshall.com. Good evening, Andrew. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Very good. Thank you for coming on tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Anything you want to add to that intro? Anything I'm missing?
No, that's good.
Okay. Well, the reason why I invited you on tonight was to discuss, the great tax-exempt foundations. You've done extensive research on the robber barons of the 19th century and how they created or utilized these tax-free foundations as a tool for transforming society. Want to give us a little background on that?
Sure. Well, the robber barons were the very wealthy monopoly, oligopoly industrialists of the 19th century. So you had the Rockefellers are the obvious ones, the Harrimans, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, of course, and a host of others. They essentially rapidly consolidated their domination of the American economy in the latter 19th century. But this was also a time of major upheaval in a number of different areas of society, not the least of which was the Civil War having ended the slave system. And so there was a major adjustment that took place in the United States as a result of that. But also in addition, there was large waves of immigration bringing in mostly poor immigrants from Ireland, from Eastern Europe, a lot of Jewish immigrants, a lot of Asian immigrants, and this was creating, especially for the domestic, industrial, and political elite, was creating major problems in terms of how to deal with these immigrant populations. So you had a number of very racist ideas springing up, which found some grounding in the ideology of eugenics. But there was also mass unrest, protests, resistance, the development of socialist, anarchist, and other radical movements who were demanding not simply slow reform, but more radical revolutionary change in the structure of society. So this presented another major problem for the established elites. And then in addition to that, you had the development of a more middle-class oriented society, a more professional class, educated, literate, who had access through the development of the printing press and other means to increased information. There was spread of journalism, newspapers, pamphlets, other sources of information, which were mobilizing not simply the lower classes who lacked literacy, but the middle classes who were increasingly agitated at the consolidated wealth of the rich few, and were wanting changes in that area as well. And you also had the fact that the United States was becoming an overseas empire at the time. This was a development that really began to spring forth in the late 19th century, particularly with the Spanish-American War and the acquisition of the Philippines and elsewhere across the Pacific. So you had a number of different factors, and those are just a few of them, which coalesced to create essentially a crisis of structural power in the United States. So one of the main responses to this crisis was to support the development of post-secondary education. And specifically, that meant establishing a strong university system, because universities, they were always sort of developed around creating, developing, fostering the domestic elite. But up until the late 19th century, they were not so concerned with a more specific education, but rather the development of, upstanding gentlemen. And getting a proper education in the more uh, pre-industrial structure of society, whereas these new universities that began to emerge, such as University of Chicago, which was founded by John D. Rockefeller, Vanderbilt University, and a number of others that were frequently founded by the robber barons, were more interested in aspects related to the social sciences, which began to develop also at this time. Uh, in that immediate period, it was the issue of sociology, which was of great interest. And the first major area of sociology studies was founded at the University of Chicago. And sociology's principal interest at the time was in understanding the nature of social control. So this became a central element of the social sciences, of the university system, and of what would become the philanthropic foundations. The notion that social control was not simply a means, but also an objective, that in times of social upheaval, distress, instability, the main objective was to have social control, and that a major means of achieving this was through social engineering. And this became institutionalized not only in the university system, where the social sciences were developed, not only sociology, but you also had political science and economics, which were being developed with a lot of money from these robber barons. But then this became even more direct in the case of the founding of the major foundations. So you had, for example, John D. Rockefeller founded the General Education Board in 1902, which was a major institution where rich industrialists and financiers would pool their money, and that would in turn be used to support the development of social science research and educational programs and university development and other educational endeavors with a view to supporting the social sciences in the application of social engineering for the objective of social control. And the major foundations in this process that were founded in the early 20th century were the Carnegie Corporation, founded in 1911, and then the Rockefeller Foundation, officially founded in 1913. Later, the Ford Foundation came onto the scene in the 1930s and quickly became the richest and most influential foundation on the scene. But at least for the first half of the 20th century and going into the post-war era, these three foundations, and it should be noted that there was extensive concentration of leadership and crossover of leadership between these foundations. So you would have officials moving from one to the other. These three foundations were central institutions in the development of not only the 20th century educational system, not only in the United States, but exporting it abroad, the development of the social sciences, principally economics and political science, as well as the development of the eugenics movement and the exporting of the eugenics movement across much of the industrial world. They also supported, in time, they also supported the development of think tanks and other institutions, including the Council on Foreign Relations, which was founded in 1921, later also to include the Bilderberg Group and Trilateral Commission. And they also even supported the development of social movement organizations, non-governmental organizations, and other institutions. And this is largely designed in an effort to not only create an avenue for energies that otherwise might be used against the existing system, but to better engineer the structure of society, to allow the existing structure to adapt and change in order to better maintain itself and to become more secure and stable in the long term. So that was sort of the context in which the foundations emerged. And in which they evolved over time.
You mentioned it was primarily focused at secondary or post-secondary education.
Yeah, that was one of the main
Yeah,
areas of interest.
because I guess in the 19th century you had the compulsory education movement. That was largely driven by industrialists, correct? In the United States.
Uh, I believe so. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean that was a major factor of it, and that was precisely because of urbanization and
Hmm.
bringing in the populations from the rural areas into urban areas. So that developed with urbanization because with all these people concentrated in city centers, you wanted them to be busy and occupied.
Yeah, because in the 19th century, education at the time was overwhelmingly private or very local. The one-home schoolhouse, and
Sure,
there's
yeah.
a lot of homeschooling. That was kind of the culture at the time, especially with rural America. But literacy rates were extremely high in the United States by all accounts, without any governmental influence. And the although compulsory education, I think, was sold as sort of a philanthropic or societal benefit argument, there are some researchers who claim that it was imposed to collectivize and sort of make the masses docile and easier to manage, much like the what you said with the universities, opening up the universities.
Sure, there are certainly those elements.
Yeah, yeah. I had this quote from Reverend Frederick T. Gates. He was a business advisor to John D. Rockefeller.
Hmm.
The quote went, just bear with me. It's paragraph. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and, unhampered by tradition, we work our own good will upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We should not try to make these people, or any of their children, into philosophers and men of learning or of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We should not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambitions to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. So that's, I guess that's this view the people as human resources as the.
Indeed. And it should be added that ultimately they had to do all of those things
Mm-hmm.
in some capacity. And I think that's also just an important point to make and to keep in mind throughout the whole history of philanthropy and educational development is that there is, at times and in certain ways, a difference between the objectives and the results, and that one does not necessarily determine the other in a sort of total sense. So, just to kind of explain, um, if the objectives are as clearly stated by many officials at the time who were involved in this whole process of developing education and the educational system, if the objective was social control, was to have a population which was capable of participating in society, but not necessarily questioning society or its structures, power structures. Um, that did not mean necessarily that all of the results and all of that funding only supported that objective. There are always unforeseen consequences, and there are always, in one way or another, a corollary to this. So if they support, education and literacy with a specific purpose in mind, that may be effective for their purposes. But on the other hand, there's always going to be unforeseen elements so that literacy and these types of things can ultimately work against the power structures. And this is something that actually did take place going into the 1960s and 70s, where the whole educational system that was really fostered and supported by these industrial and financial elites was no longer as supportive as it once had been, and actually went into what they termed a major educational crisis, and they had to find another way of dealing with that.
Was this the crisis of democracy?
This was a major element of
Yeah,
that crisis,
yeah.
absolutely. And that was a crisis that was literally of their own making in that respect. And so, just in the sense that they um, pour into money, create institutional development, support ideological construction, and have very specific, let's not call them benevolent, objectives in mind. This does not mean that these are foregone conclusions, or that anywhere where their money flowed is simply a discredited outright. And there are many countless examples of how these institutions, officials, and objectives were equally capable and at times even actually countered their very interests and objectives. So it's like anything, especially when we discuss institutions and ideologies and individuals of power, there are many complexities that have to be taken into account. And it I think it's just generally important to avoid sort of black and white understandings of these types of issues because they are not black and white.
Yeah, because you're not. Although, like people like Brzezinski like to use the term, grand chessboard and moving pieces. You're not
Yes,
dealing with wooden chess pieces. You're dealing with dynamic human beings.
exactly.
And
And
so,
them least of, and they're the people doing this are human beings. And if anybody who is or knows a human being, which is presumably everybody listening, then they know exactly that where humans exist, there's always going to be problems and flaws and failures and, make a lot of making it up as you go along.
hmm
And there's a tendency to think that those at the top of the social structure, while having very long-term views and objectives in comparison with the rest of the general population, there's a view to sort of see them almost as a omnipotent force. But the reality is that they do this kind of piecemeal, step-by-step approach more than anybody else, and that their approach, precisely because they undertake an approach for long-term planning, um, it has many more possibilities of blowing up in their face and frequently does. And so these uh, complexities and dynamics should also be acknowledged simply for the sake of understanding that in human systems, there are not only strengths, and I think that the foundation system and the educational system is and has been a major strength of the domestic and increasingly global economic and financial elite. But it equally has been a disruptive force against that economic and industrial elite. That um, it's it can almost create the basis for their own downfall in that sense. It has made the system more stable. It has made it more secure from a top-down perspective. But there's no reason to think that it's infallible. And by acknowledging the various flaws and sort of uh, complexities of that kind of structure, we as a general population are able to better take advantage of that system, to take advantage of those flaws, to take advantage of the benefits and exploit the flaws, I guess is a better way of putting that.
hmm Well, a good example, though it's not necessarily involved with education, and would be the creation of the internet, where
Absolutely.
this grew out of DARPA, and this was for sharing information. Some would say it's even why it's enabled these people incredible surveillance uh, technique or ability, because everything now is digital. With everything
Hmm.
digitized, all transactions, communications can literally be scooped up and then at least saved, not analyzed eventually. At the same time, it's enabled people to communicate and learn things, read things that they otherwise would not have been able to do because the publishing houses and the schools themselves would have stifled the information. Now there's a whole lot of information out there going, and that's
Too
had
much.
too much. Yeah, and yeah, it's because it's sensory overkill.
Yeah.
But it's good to show that they're not. This isn't a cabal or group of elite flawlessly executing their plans. Uh, they're not in control either. They just exert a lot of control. And,
Absolutely.
yes, but they're not completely in control. There's always the unforeseen thing. It's
Yeah.
it's not the knowledge problem.
Exactly. I
Too many
remember there was
variables.
one hearing in the U.S. Senate regarding sort of internet control, and at the time, Senator Jay Rockefeller, I believe,
Yeah,
he said that we made a mistake in creating the internet.
which reveals a whole lot right there.
Indeed, yeah. But I mean, like as far as like discrediting um, results based upon the source of funding, it's hard to get more nefarious than DARPA, which is, just
Yes.
the Department of Mad Scientists inside the Pentagon.
Yeah. That's
And it's like in any sort of kids movie or anything, when you have the mad scientists, if they were in the real world today, they'd be employed by DARPA.
yes.
And that was kind of the agency that was at the center of that system and the creation of the internet and the technological computer revolution. But the fact that that entity uh, that this emanated from that entity and has become what it is today. I mean, that there's no way that could have been envisioned by DARPA or its scientists or
Hmm.
technicians at the time. And the results are profound and evolving, to say the least. And
Well,
yes, we do have this system of total surveillance, which is unprecedented. But we also have the unprecedented means to potentially challenge that if
yeah, like
we
I can
so
call, I,
choose.
I can call you up on the internet and have this conversation
Exactly.
right there, and I'm sure it bothers them to no end, but I'm sure there's at any given moment they're thinking of ways to curb it or control it.
For
Uh,
sure.
you know. But that's education. In the couple articles that I read, I think it's a piece. It's a part of your People's Book Project, correct?
Yeah, Once Upon a Time. That's sort of
Oh, okay.
move beyond, but
Nevertheless, it's
yes.
some wonderful research in that, and some points made. And you brought up the efforts by the British in Africa utilizing the I guess the American research, which was this what was
Tuskegee.
the Tuskegee Phelps Stokes Fund?
Yep,
Yeah, and this was to manage the Negro population, right? In the early part of the 20th century, and the British tried to apply it to their colonial possessions in Africa, right?
absolutely. It was
And you go into that, just creating a local elites so they can control, the whole imperial project. Can you
sure,
explain that, and then maybe its application to the United States, because we had similar efforts made here uh,
sure,
with the Yeah, I think you alluded to that with the universities creating this whole sort of system of prescriptive knowledge of these universities, like the social sciences.
hmm
The American Historical Association was created by the Rockefellers to control historical interpretation. Sociology and the political science was sort of like a foundation created association to control the parameters of the debate and our understanding of how the world should work. And the British saw this and applied it to Africa, correct? Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's
Okay.
in at least in terms of the education for the domestic black population in the United
Hmm.
States. That's what the British wanted to export to their colonies in sub-Saharan Africa,
Hmm.
because that education, which is kind of goes by a few different names. You have the Tuskegee. It's generally referred to as the Tuskegee philosophy from the Tuskegee Institute, um, and it was uh, initially supported by the Southern Education Board, the General Education Board, both of which were Rockefeller institutions. Then you had other foundations come onto the scene: the Jeans Fund, the Slater Fund, the Phelps Stokes Fund. And again, there was an enormous amount of overlap between the leadership of these institutions and their main objective at the time, because these sort of formed and emerged beginning in the last couple years of the 19th century and then in the first years and decades of the 20th century. And their main objective was basically, or I guess the main problem in their mind was, what do we do with the newly freed slaves? Um, so there was a number of responses that came. This was a process driven by northern industrial elites. So it was not driven by the southern former plantation owners. But the results were ultimately very similar in many respects, because their main objective was to develop an education for Black Americans in which they would be trained in vocational services, in labor, and other more, let's call them physical uh, efforts. And ultimately, it kind of seemed a bit absurd, just in a basic sense, because this is what the black population had been doing for so long that they developed an entire educational philosophy and system which was geared around training and educating the black population to do what they had already been doing for well over a century. But this was the main objective, precisely to keep the black population at the lower end, at the bottom, in fact, of the social hierarchy. So they were not to get an education in literature and the arts and sciences and these other things, which might have the much undesired effect of raising their expectations. And thus, since those expectations had no ability to be met, that would create what's often referred to by historians as sort of the tyranny of unmet expectations, which can create great instability in society. And so their main objective was to maintain the social hierarchy in that sense. And then, of course, there were other elements, sort of corollaries to this in the criminal justice system, so that there was a host of new laws passed across the South and elsewhere, which essentially, to varying degrees, criminalized black life so that you could round up the newly freed slaves for, standing in a doorway or looking at a white woman or, just anything really. Just being there at the wrong place at the wrong time was crime enough. And then these newly mass imprisoned populations were used as cheap labor to work on industrializing much of the South, but also to work as cheap labor elsewhere. And that was essentially a reimagining of the slave system. But instead of, raising slave populations and feeding them and clothing them from birth to death, you just take them at their best years, their most physically able years, and just imprison them and use them as cheap labor in that sense, or in mines and elements like this. And that program attracted the attention of South African colonial administrators who came to the United States to study that system of, let's call it forced labor, in mines and other industrial endeavors. And then on the other hand, the educational side, that attracted the attention of the British colonial elites and a lot of missionary societies who came to the United States in the first few decades of the 20th century to study this Tuskegee educational philosophy because they wanted to export it to Britain's colonies in Africa. And so then, with the support of the Phelps-Stokes Fund, the Jeans Fund, the Slater Fund, as well as the hefty financial backing of the Carnegie Corporation and the Rockefeller Foundation, some of these ideologies were then exported to African colonies, notably in South Africa, but also in Kenya and elsewhere. There's a quote that I wrote down from Kenya's colonial secretary at the time, who said that the ultimate objective was to ensure, quote, an intelligent, cheerful, self-respecting, and generally docile and willing to learn African native. So that kind of summed up the ideology in that sense. And it was also articulated by Thomas Jesse Jones, who was a major leader at the Phelps-Stokes Fund and was one of the primary individuals driving this process, who explained that the objective specific to the South African case was to keep the black population as, quote, junior partners in the firm. And again, this was just kind of an articulation of those, or this was the actualization of those beliefs, the implementation of that. And that was for both in the United States and in Africa, Um, these objectives, these specific programs, were geared towards the black domestic populations, to keeping the population which was at arguably the um, lowest rung of the social hierarchy, to keep them in that place. Um, on the other hand, they developed educational initiatives and institutions which were designed specifically to train and develop domestic and foreign elites. And this is where post-secondary education came into the process more. And this is where the foundations, the big money foundations, became even more involved. So the Tuskegee philosophy, this was pushed more by the foundations like Phelps Stokes and Slater and others. But Carnegie, Ford, and Rockefeller foundations were the driving force in uh, developing the study of international relations in the United States, developing specific institutes for that study at Yale and other universities, exporting that internationally by supporting the development of parallel institutions at major European universities, such as the London School of Economics was a big one, which really American money, and specifically Rockefeller money, transformed into a major university. And then you had that kind of process. They also developed what was called area studies. And this was specifically in the post-World War II period. And area studies, which were fostered at major American universities like Harvard, Yale, and others, were designed around educating American elites primarily, but with a proper understanding of the different regions of the world, so the different areas. So you had, African studies, Middle East studies, Asian studies, Soviet studies, and this was a method of specializing knowledge, of concentrating it, but of educating these intellectuals, young intellectuals, with a view that they would then go into, of course, coming from very prominent universities, that they would go into positions of power, that they would go into the State Department, into aid agencies, into Treasury Department, into managing foreign policy, that and with that proper education and understanding, they would be better able to effectively manage the world, which at the end of World War II was the main objective of the United States, to manage the planet. And this was a means of doing that. Alternatively, or again, as a corollary to that, in these various regions, in those areas of the world, these major foundations also fostered the development of major universities of social science research. They had some in Central Africa, in Uganda, in the Congo. They Ford developed major economics programs in Indonesia. They developed other programs in Latin America and elsewhere. And this was in an effort to train, quote unquote, indigenous elites in these nations and regions who were given a proper education, and proper is in quotations here, on sort of the Western concept of social sciences, which provides a particular ideological slant, in that this type of education looks at social problems as largely technical issues. So the first thing you do in the social sciences, or at least at that time, was to separate everything. You specialize and concentrate. So you have sociology, you have political science, you have economics. These are separate spheres of knowledge and understanding. Of course, they're totally interrelated and interdependent, and there's elements and areas where that can be acknowledged and studied. But ultimately, you create these sort of specialized areas. And then you generate, support the development of knowledge in those areas, so that you're able to train people who have a very good understanding of the political structure, of the economic structure, of the social structure. But they almost never communicate or understand each other. And so then they're only able, in actual fact, to understand elements of each of these concepts because the reality is that they're all totally intertwined and interactive. So the failure, for example, of the economists to understand political structures comes back into economics because then it ultimately means that they fail to understand the political realities of the economic structure and vice versa. And so, but this specialized knowledge had a profound impact in terms of supporting technical solutions to complex social problems. So, a country, for example, in Africa that was throwing off the reins of colonialism, domination by European empires, was generating a domestic elite being properly educated in Western ideas, who then look to establishing an independent nation state free of colonial domination, but where they accept as a starting basis the general Western concepts of politics and economics, so that they attempt to modernize their states, to develop their states within a wider global framework, which is ultimately defined by the West. So instead of being perhaps a more revolutionary movement or revolutionary change in these nations or how they were structured or developed, it was about pushing for a slower reform-oriented step-by-step approach to change so as not to threaten not only domestic but international power structures, which is kind of a euphemism for empire.
So basically, they're seeking to compartmentalize all the thinking here, so no one sees the bigger picture, the full picture.
To a degree, but
Yeah.
that created its own problems because then what would happen is that nobody really knows much of the larger picture, and that is always essential to have, in addition to specialized knowledge, which has major benefits, um, just in terms of the actual development of knowledge of information, specializing on that, on the details and intricacies of these things. There is a
Hmm.
major place for that. But when there was no crossover or interaction between these elements, they became increasingly isolated and as a result, increasingly almost, I wouldn't go so far as to say irrelevant, but um, let's call it troubled.
Hmm.
They, the failure to have a lot of what's now called interdisciplinary research and understanding would emanate out into the world so that ultimately to have effective managers of not only a foreign country but of the domestic society, to have effective managers of international relations, they ultimately had to be better educated in the complexities of that system. So in understanding that, yes, economics and politics are not, in fact, separate and um, uh, independent of one another.
Hmm.
So there was eventually an acknowledgement that, yes, we're having some problems with this. And this was particularly the Ford Foundation even attempted to develop a specific area of political science, which they called behavioralism. And that ultimately became a failure. And they poured tons of money into this and developed research institutes and over many, many years. But it ultimately went essentially nowhere because they failed to um, advance political science in the concept of opening up and understanding other disciplines and expanding knowledge in that sense. It was too specialized, too focused, and it was an attempt to be too rigid, I think, in their sort of so-called ideological purity, which, ironically, the main driving ideology behind all of this, or the justification, was that it was, in a sense, at least this was the rhetoric in which these programs were pushed and advanced, was that they are non-ideological. They are technical, they are specific, they are what's called disinterested. So they don't take any sort of moral stance or an I and by ideological they mean, essentially you just kind of rid the disciplines of ultimately leftists, socialists and others, and anything which is very critical, that's ideological. Anything which is very critical of the existing system or the power structures, that's ideology. And that's to be kept out of these professional disciplines, which are simply, in their concept anyway, which are simply about disinterested technical knowledge so that they can effectively, scientifically manage society.
An example that might be in Africa, where you have, let's say, a tribe or a grouping that have these ancestral homelands that and that maybe they're sitting on top of some natural resources, and so a foreign corporation comes in and installs a satrap regime and employs that regime to force off those people off the land. And so they can claim and say, well, no one owned that land, and they impose, let's say, the Western concept of property rights.
Sure.
And they claim that those resources, or they have a local person claim the resources, and they pay them. At the same time, the people that are forced off the land are either forced into the cities, where they're generally unemployed, but they can be exploited for factory labor, or a revolution starts, and when the natives become restless, they're painted red and called communists. That was rather a frequent occurrence during the Cold War, correct?
Indeed.
Yeah, and that's usually what happened. So, I mean, that happened all throughout Africa and in through Latin America. But what's interesting, I was looking at the your description of the education system. It's almost as if they're trying to impose an informal caste system without using that term, by limiting the education of certain groups by caste. Whether you're a white laborer or a black laborer, you're going to get a certain type of education, so you don't get any uppity ideas. Correct? Is that a simple way to put it?
Yeah, I mean
Okay.
that was a pretty main element, at least initially. Obviously, that's changed a great
It
deal.
changes,
But
yeah, with circumstances. Because
yeah,
I mean, there's the Second World War fundamentally changed a lot in the United
everything.
States
Yeah,
with the migration north. Then you get the revolution of rising expectations, you could say, in the post-war
indeed.
economy. And then you get the civil rights movement, which I think you've written and others written out, that was largely co-opted. I think
To a degree. To a
yeah.
degree.
But it's interesting. You're talking in Africa, you have this process of decolonization. So, but let's say the Western or let's just say the Anglo-American Empire isn't willing to give up Africa. One thing they claim, they're trying to protect it from the Soviet Union, um, but they want those cheap resources, at least what they call cheap resources. They don't want to, I guess, deal fairly with the locals. So they set up this system, and I think you provided a quote from McGeorge Bundy, who was he? I guess he was a national security advisor to Kennedy.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember because there was the two Bundys and they
Yeah,
were
and
brothers.
one was the Ford Foundation head guy. He
Yeah,
did the
and they
foundation
would.
circuit. Yeah,
Yeah, I think McGeorge was because McGeorge was the national security advisor, and then William Bundy was, um, or maybe it was the
yeah.
other way
I
around. I
think it
can't
was Ford.
remember.
Well, but it shows how interlocked it is, either by
Yes.
family or basically the alphabet soup agencies, intelligence agencies are working along with the foundations, because ultimately they were created by the same group of elitists.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But his quote is here: everything the Ford Foundation does is to make the world safe for capitalism. Of course, what they mean by capitalism really is more, is leaving the world open for exploitation by certain, corporate interests,
Yeah. Of
without
course.
having to deal with the locals in a fair, equitable manner. And the intelligence agencies are acting. What the intelligence agencies are, it's a way to socialize the cost or the risk of these corporations, because they enshroud it in national security. You know,
Yeah. Well, I mean, just look at the first major overseas operation of the CIA. It was just to control oil in Iran
yeah, that was for the benefit of for Anglo American, which became
for
BP,
British Petroleum. Yeah.
but then they set up the Seven Sisters, all came in and took advantage of that.
Yes.
And I believe that was what Kermit Roosevelt,
Yes. Yeah.
and wasn't he given like a sinecure with Gulf Oil after he pulled that off? It's,
Most likely.
yeah, so that's how it works. That's interesting. Yeah, how they pay their people, but Yeah, so basically, what they're creating a condition. This is very analogous to like the Rhodes Trust system that was established after the death of Cecil Rhodes, and you have, I guess it was Milner, the Milner
Hmm.
Roundtable. Had they tried to? They set up the Rhodes Foundation, the Rhodes scholarships to control education to make it see that the world was understood through a British lens to secure the empire, and it seems like it's very similar objectives.
Yeah, I mean there's certainly an argument for kind of an integration of ideology and objectives there. I mean, if you look at Cecil Rhodes, then it's I mean he had very specific ideas too, that it was
Hmm.
very much a British Empire and that's all, and we should just retake America, and how awful that they got out of our grip. But I mean, there's those sort of roundtable groups certainly had influence in the development of institutions like the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States and the Royal Institute of International Affairs
Hmm.
in London. Um, but ultimately, power shifted across the Atlantic in quite a dramatic sense. So and I just say this because there has been a lot of very good research done on the role of these sort of roundtable groups in the development of the kind of, I guess you could call it a think tank culture.
Hmm.
So bringing together, academic elites with industrial, financial, corporate, foreign policy elites, where they have forums where they can, debate, discuss, disagree, but also try to establish consensus and work together in a better way so as to better manage society in their collective interest. I mean,
Hmm.
that's kind of a basic socializing structure, and one which is adaptable and very effective anywhere it's employed, generally speaking. So that had a major influence in that sense. But there's also a tendency in some circles, or commentary, I should say, in discussing things like the roundtable groups, that um, because the objective was to retake America under the British Empire, initially speaking, anyway, and because these groups, effectively made inroads into the United States, that therefore 1 + 1 = 2. America is just an appendage of this mysterious behind-the-scenes British Empire.
That would be kind of like the
The
Living LaRouche
Oh yeah,
interpretation.
that I yes, I don't put much actual weight into that interpretation, to be honest. And I think the last, let's say, 70 years of British history is nothing if not a testament to the fact that they are, if anything, an appendage to the American empire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think they might argue that these are transnational now. Looking at maybe we shouldn't look at the American elite. They see themselves as transnationals, and this like it was David Rothkopf wrote the book The Superclass,
Yes.
and he numbered it about 6,000
Hmm.
people who pretty much they go to the same universities,
Of which
intermarry.
he is also a member, I might
Yeah,
add.
yeah. And so this is kind of a revelation of the method, I guess. I like to review. Hey, look what we're doing. He's
Yes.
a well-paid functionary, I guess. I don't know how.
Indeed.
He's one of these people I think you cite, educated properly, right?
Well, exactly.
Yeah. So
Exactly.
he sees the world in that way, and so, but the idea that perhaps to look at nation states is largely superficial. These people, these are playthings, and this is why they get together at Bilderberg and whatever meeting these sort of these transnational get-togethers, and kind of decide how to carve up the world, and so it's hard to. I think it's hard to know what's at the top of the pyramid, who's at the capstone of the pyramid. But there's something definitely is going on. I would agree that there's a tendency to oversimplify these things. In the absence of full knowledge, we tended to say, "Hey, I got it all figured out." I just think
Yeah. It's
basically,
always so tempting, right?
yeah, yeah. I just think you're dealing broadly speaking, you're dealing with a grouping of sort of criminal syndicates that get together and meet. That's the
Yes.
best
Yes.
description.
It's a
Yeah.
mafiocracy
Yeah,
system.
and some more, you could say that part of you have the Zionist faction, the WASP faction, the bankers, and who knows what else. And they all kind of get together, and it's hard. Not any one of them rules the roost. It's just that it's a group of elites, and they probably have fights from time to time.
Most certainly. Globalization's Game of Thrones.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Watch Game of Thrones, and it's how the elite rule, how they play. Um, it's interesting. One of the other talks, you talk about how the foundations control the opposition, how they can. I alluded to it in the civil rights movement, and there are many accounts of the civil rights movement kind of being manipulated and co-opted, in many ways discredited. The so-called counterculture of the '60s was largely, with COINTELPRO, it's obvious, but there are other more subtle ways of using the foundations to manipulate the culture to kind of create a dialectic. I think politicians have even made reference to it, like Nixon's Southern strategy, playing to the right during the primary and going to the center during the election, manipulating the populace's emotions and fears. And you could say in the '60s, how much of the counterculture of the '60s was manipulated or radicalized intentionally by some of these foundations in order to marginalize the middle class and marginalize to alienate the middle class and marginalize the trenchant criticism of the Vietnam War, which is at the beginning of the '60s or the mid '60s was sort of a college educated and academic criticism, and it became kind of this hippie counterculture thing, which drove the middle class insane. It scared the heck out of them, and they voted for Nixon. Have you done any research in that, or any opinions?
Not on the specific counterculture, but more so on civil rights and the kind of social movement
Mm-hmm.
developments. And uh, I couldn't say that I agree entirely with that interpretation. I think that it was far more, at least when it comes to the civil rights movement, the role that foundations played in supporting civil rights organizations was not in an effort to support the more radical elements and alienate others. It was exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm.
It was in an effort to support the slower, more reform-oriented, legalistic approach to change and the entities that supported that approach, while undermining the more radical, revolutionary
Mm-hmm.
uh, pro projects and ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, it was also they were also very late to the scene. So, the civil rights movement dates back from at least that particular phase of the civil rights movement dates back to the early mid 1950s. Yeah, just in terms of support by foundations for specific civil rights organizations was designed in the later years to ultimately undermine specifically the Black Power movement in the United States. So there was an effort to push for Nixon's program of black capitalism instead of black power, to integrate black elites within the existing social structure instead of allowing Black Power movement or other more radical movements to outright challenge the system, or worse, create alternatives. So that was middle class concerns were not really, I think, at the center of foundation efforts when it comes to supporting social movements or the civil rights movement. It's more, I mean, ultimately, the elite generally view the middle class historically and presently as a bit of a buffer, and between the poor masses and themselves. And so long as you can essentially have the middle class maintain themselves as consumers and remain largely obedient and ignorant, then the system is able to sustain itself. But if the middle class joins or supports the lower classes, the poor classes, then the rich few, the superclass, have a real problem. So their efforts are in supporting social movements are geared largely around undermining and sidelining more radical elements in an effort to promote more reformist and legalistic movements and elements. And you always there's never been a time where the big foundations supported some movement, or because the foundations got a lot of flack for their funding of civil rights organizations, and they got a lot of flack from official circles, from Congress, and from a lot of politicians and established institutions and other elites, and this sort of their bad PR that they got from some of these elements continued in other areas, like support for radical scholars overseas and other academics. This was seen by, there was even a major committee investigation in Congress that suggested that the foundations were supporting radical Marxism. And
there was the Reese Committee hearing.
Yeah. And, some of these committees developed interesting information regarding history in these foundations. But it's also important to remember that most of these types of committees were started with an extreme ideological slant. And this was, largely coming out of the McCarthy era, and it was during the Cold War context. And so anything hinting of communism was just evil Reds. Mm-hmm. And so for them, and like you mentioned, in terms of the understanding of an increasingly transnational elite based around finance and corporate interests. But we also have to understand that back then, and even still today, there is in not only the United States, but any nation, a domestic elite, including a domestic economic and industrial elite, typically, who aren't exactly that interested in the more international parameters of power and the system. They just, they want their cake, and their interests are internal and focused. And these interests have often bumped up against each other. So you have, there's no one cohesive elite. Yes, there is an increasingly so, a transnational elite whose interests are increasingly aligned, and who operate together in many respects. But they all have their own domestic elites and domestic elite structures and challengers and problems. Even if you look back at the United States in the 1970s, when Nixon suspended the dollar-gold convertibility in 1971, you had a domestic industrial elite, specifically in a lot of export-oriented corporations, so big companies in the United States, in steel industry and others, who were very supportive of Nixon's policies, which included, which supported domestic industry to export internationally. So it was of great interest to them. But on the other hand, you had very critical elements in the American ruling class, particularly financiers, who, while they liked certain elements of Nixon's program, they opposed the tariffs on foreign industries and others, because their interest was more in the smooth functioning of the global monetary and financial system, which required more of those barriers to be reduced, while a lot of domestic industrialists wanted more barriers on others to benefit them. So there was by no means a total